word for excess supply in the labor market? Surplus is one word, unemployment is the other. People want to work, no one wants to hire them. That's unemployment. So excess supply in the labor market is also known as unemployment. Again, the short side of the market is going to win. Okay, so you can't force firms to hire workers that they don't want to hire. So the equilibrium employment level is going to drop. I guess I'm using W here for minimum wage or something. I don't exactly know why I'm using the subscript W, but in any case, that's what I started with, so that's what I'm going to go with. All right, so what's happened here? All right, so the minimum wage was great in the sense that for people who have a job, their wage rates went up, but it was bad in the sense that it led to a drop in employment levels and it led to unemployment. And that's because we're getting taken away from this really sufficient level of employment here. There are firms who would like to hire workers, whose willingness to pay for workers is greater than their willingness to, the amount you'd have to pay them to get them to work. But because the firms are forced to pay this high minimum wage, they're not willing to, they can't by law interact with, there are these sort of profitable exchanges that aren't able to take place. Okay, so that's going to be, again, a source of inefficiency here. Okay. So again, what are some of the negative implications of minimum wage laws? We've talked about this. We've talked about some of them. First, we have lower employment levels. And this is actually something that economists not only worry about, but have studied a lot. There's been a lot of research out there trying to look at whether changes in the minimum wage laws actually lower employment levels. Because if you're trying to help workers, and you're just, by increasing their wages, but at the cost of having fewer workers actually have a job, then this policy may not be potentially good. I'll tell you that there is very weak evidence that the kinds of increases in the minimum wage that we typically see the government impose don't seem to have a very large effect on employment levels. That doesn't mean that increases in the minimum wage would never have an effect on employment levels, but the kinds of changes that we tend to see out there in the market they're relatively small. The minimum wage is relatively low. There isn't a lot of evidence that they negatively affect employment levels. But theoretically, it's possible. And certainly, if the government came in and introduced a minimum wage of $100 an hour, I guarantee people would lose their jobs. Okay. So maybe at $8 an hour or $10 an hour, it's not going to have a big effect. But if you push that out to the extreme, then I think the story would be different. And then because of this unemployment, you have this increased job search activity. Right, so instead of having people productively employed in jobs, they're wasting their time, their talents, and their resources out there searching for jobs. Okay? And that's sort of costly from an economic standpoint because they're not producing anything. Yeah?
Why do we have minimum wage?
Why do we have a minimum wage?
Yeah.
So this is sort of like the rent control example. Okay? There was a lot of political pressure to make sure people have enough, they're earning enough to be able to support a family or even support themselves. And that's exactly why. So the reason why we have minimum wages is to make sure that there aren't people who are working in jobs where they really can't support themselves. Well, that's the problem, right? That's the problem. And so economists are not super in favor of minimum wage laws. Economists are more in favor of tax subsidies to the low-income population, other methods of subsidizing the low-income population. Okay, so again, the message here is it's not that we don't care about low-wage earners. It's just that we recognize that this is inefficient. Maybe there are other things that we can do, other ways of supporting the low-income population that would be helpful. For example, I'll mention it really quickly. There's something called the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is a tax credit available to low-income workers. I'll get your question in just a minute. And what the Earned Income Tax Credit does is, at least initially, the more you work, the larger the tax credit you get. Okay, so it provides these really strong work incentives, so it doesn't sort of distort the labor market in ways that we would worry about, and it's providing cash assistance to the low-income population. And the amount that's available to individuals depends on, for example, how many children they have, et cetera. And so that's a policy that economists really stand behind. Economists are much more mixed in terms of the minimum wage. Having said that, going back to number one here, there's not a lot of evidence that the kinds of minimum wage laws that have been imposed have had a large negative impact on employment. Theoretically, it's possible, but we don't actually observe it. You know, again, with the caveat that it's given the kinds of minimum wage laws that have been imposed. Yeah.
So if you took out these laws, do you think the minimum wage would normalize to a higher price? Since it's like $8 right now, if you took out these laws, would it go up to like 10 by itself?
That's the theory. That's the theory. The theory would be that, the California minimum wage, I forget what it is, it's something, 8 something. Is it what?
It depends on the city.
The
Like
city.
San Francisco, I know it's 10.
So yeah, so cities have things called living wage laws. Different areas impose different. There are minimum wages. There's a federal minimum wage. There's state minimum wages. Sometimes there are local minimum wages. It really varies from region to region. But the idea would be that if you took away those minimum wages, that the price might go up a little bit. Wages might increase a little bit. But I'm sorry, I said that completely backwards. Wages would fall. Thank you. So you were recognizing it. If you took away the minimum wage, the idea is that wages would fall, but employment would go up potentially. Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like roots and feelings are mechanisms to kind of match up demands people with their buying power and receiving power. I was wondering if there's any kind of mechanism in economics where it's really possible to set up a system where everyone that demands something has the power to be able to get it.
So I think what you're saying here, and let me go back and make sure. I'm going to just go back and give you put up a picture, just so we can talk about it. What you're talking about is that there are people down here that demand whatever this good is, and they're not going to get it. There isn't, that's not part of a market system. A market system says, an equilibrium like this, a market like this says those people don't get it. But there are certain goods and services that we think are so critical for people to have that we as a society might make a decision to make them universally available. Healthcare is a perfect example of that. Okay, there seems to be this sense that people should be able to afford healthcare. You sort of think if you're sick, people should have the right to go to a doctor, even if their ability to pay. They demand health care. It's not that they don't demand it, but they may not be able to afford it at the equilibrium price. And so there are, the mechanisms that are out there are things like universal health care coverage. That's the example, or education. Right? So there are things like that. Education is freely provided in K through 12. And so there are things like that. The government might step in and say, we as a society think that everyone should have access to this good, so the government's going to provide it. Okay. Other questions? These are good questions. All right, let me quickly jot down a couple more problems with minimum wage laws. You also have black market employment. What does that mean? These are just people who are working off the books. If you or your family has ever hired like a gardener, a housekeeper, anything like that, chances are good that's taking place off the books. And the minimum wage laws encourage that kind of thing to take place. Babysitting, all off the books. And it also allows for discrimination. The intuition here is the same as we saw for rent controls. If there's a long line of people waiting outside your door to work at your company or work at your firm because of this minimum wage law, then you can more easily pick and choose who you want to hire. And so potentially we might see increases in discrimination because of the imposition of minimum wage laws.
does it really even make a difference if you had a ceiling or a floor? Because somebody out there is going to be a group of people who don't get that, so there might be some
Yes,
cost.
so the answer to the question is people are always trying to undo these price ceilings and prices. They have an impact, but there's always this effort to undo them. Okay, we will talk more, we'll start in on elasticity on Monday. Have a